focus will be on stakeholder analysis. I really want to talk about first the strategic role that I believe communication plays in organizations. And that role involves informing, influencing, motivating behavior in support of organizational objectives, performance, and directed at both internal and external stakeholders. I'll be using the term stakeholder audience interchangeably. So in short, the reason we communicate in organizations is to persuade. And communication, I believe, also has a really critical role in building and strengthening relationships with those stakeholders. Now, every communication tactic should be framed by the answer to what's our objective. If we're so involved in day-to-day communication activities, we need to think through, why are we doing what we're doing? Even a simple email, how does it fit into the bigger picture, the strategic picture? Now, I like this graphic because it pulls together all of the elements that we need to consider when we're thinking strategically. And I would be naive to say that the communication messages we send out to employees and customers and other stakeholders directly has an effect on the results of an organization, the financial results in the case of a business. But the quality of our communication does have an impact on employee engagement, on customer satisfaction. Let me give you a quick example. If we're effective communicating to employees, that will increase their level of engagement. And we know that engagement and turnover are directly correlated. Turnover is a big cost for organizations. Let's talk a little bit about the sender-receiver. And communication always involves that interaction, that flow between the sender of communication and the receivers of communication. But let's initially focus on the sender. And here I've been really impressed over the years with the work of Robert Cialdini and his 6 principles of persuasion. Basically, to achieve our communication objectives, we have to persuade our audiences. And we have to persuade them. We can't order them. The old model, if it ever worked, certainly doesn't work today, of command and control. We need to focus on the delivery of the message as much as the message itself, something that we forget sometimes. And the other point that Cialdini makes is that persuasion is a skill because it appeals to deeply rooted human drives and needs, and it does so in predictable ways. We sometimes think some people are natural persuaders. That may be true, but we can learn as communicators how to apply the principles that Cialdini describes in a way that will help us be more persuasive. So let's take a look at them quickly. The first principle, or one of the principles he talks about, is liking. If people like you because they sense that you like them or because of the things you have in common, they're more apt to say yes. This is kind of a dynamic that we're all aware of, and I've seen it when in my corporate role, when I was working on developing strategic plans and trying to engage people in them and to communicate them, that when people see themselves as part of a larger group that has a shared identity, they're willing to take steps they wouldn't take otherwise in terms of their individual interests. And so as communicators, we need to build that sense of shared purpose whenever we can, because that shared purpose unifies people and galvanizes them. Another principle is reciprocity. If you behave in a certain way, people will respond in kind. And I've seen this happen again and again in my career. I made it a point to, as often as possible, to offer my communication skills, support, even in projects where I wasn't directly involved. And what I found was that the people I offered support to appreciated it and responded by thinking of me as a partner in their work. And I was able to go back to them in the future and ask for their help in projects that I was working on. So the notion that, hey, I'm going to raise my hand and take the initiative and be a team player really plays into the sense of reciprocity. Authority. Quote, people defer to experts and to those in positions of authority. I often think that authority and the term credibility are very closely related. And I want you to think about authority not just as people status, but authority often translated into credibility, expertise. People are more likely to be persuaded if they perceive us as knowledgeable about what we're proposing. And building that sense of credibility is just so very important, both in our communication roles and in leveraging the authority of the people that we are communicating messages for. Social proof. Here's another principle of persuasion that sometimes we forget about, but it's very, very powerful. People will do things they see other people doing, especially if they share interests and values. And here, I think, as communicators, what we really, when we're, let's say, developing a message for an internal employee audience, we need to think about the first line managers, the supervisors, and also the more informal influencers within the organization. Capture their voices, because people will respond to what their peers that they respect, people they respect, what they think, what they feel is important. And if we can leverage those voices, that will make our efforts more persuasive. Commitment consistency. If people make a public voluntary commitment, they'll try to follow through. And one of my roles in my corporate life was a facilitator of hundreds and hundreds of meetings, and the thing that I noticed was that when I made a point at the end of a meeting to say, okay, here's what we've agreed on, let's write it down and set target dates, who's going to be involved, that writing down, that formal sort of notation, whether this was a virtual meeting or a face-to-face meeting, really increased the chances that people would follow through on what they said they would in the meeting. Here again, I think you can think of a number of ways that this could play out in your communication efforts. The last of the principles is scarcity. People value things they perceive as scarce or time limited. From a marketing communication point of view, we're always encountering things like this. Use this coupon by September 15th. Do this by a certain time. Get this value, perceived value, but you have to do it soon because there's a limited supply. I also want you to think about how this principle might be applied to some situations internally. So some overall themes relating to these 6 principles of persuasion. They have even more impact when they're applied in combination. You always have to think about the ethical parameters, because you can go over the line, and one could go over the line. So ethical boundaries need to be established. Cialdini makes the point that cross-culturally these 6 principles apply, but in some cultures some of the principles have more weight than others. My final point is that goals are such a unifying force and so important in your persuasive efforts. So as you think about these 6 principles, think about how you can use them in helping you be more persuasive in the way you communicate. Now let's turn those principles of persuasion are something that the sender can think about. Obviously there's an interaction with the audience, the receiver, in order to be persuasive. But now let's focus on the audience, because understanding our audience really will enhance our ability to persuade them. And you'll notice the headings: the attributes of the audience, what's on their mind, their communication preferences. What's really important here is that last one, the desired impact on their attitudes, knowledge, and behaviors. That goes back to the communication objectives we have. This is just kind of a systematic way to look at our stakeholders, our audiences. And you can think of a number of attributes we would want to know about, ranging from their demographic characteristics to how knowledgeable they are on the subject that we're communicating about. I'm going to just hone in on 3 of them. First, generational profiles. We've got 4 generations represented in our workforce. How their communication preferences differ so dramatically. And taking Generation Y, the millennials, as an example, their experience with social media, with technology, is very, very different than the baby boomers. And if you're communicating to an audience with millennials, you have to be aware of that. Otherwise, you're not going to be very persuasive. Josh Bernoff and Charlene Lee wrote, I think, what's one of the most important books relating to communication in the digital era, and that is Groundswell. And they came up with this typology, this social technographic ladder of how people sort of where they fit in terms of their social media usage, from inactives to creators. Here again, I think being aware of where your audience is, how it's distributed along that ladder, is critically important. This, by the way, is influenced cross-culturally, as well as consumer product profiles differ here, as do your employees in different organizations. If I'm thinking about communicating with employees at IBM, there's going to be a different distribution on this ladder than employees at Best Buy, for example. So knowing this, trying to understand how my audience is distributed along this ladder, is going to make me much more effective in the way I deliver my message. Remember, delivery is as important as the message itself. Finally, mindset. We've learned that the threat response to uncertainty is a very powerful factor in whether our audience is going to be receptive to our communication. And Scarlett outlines ways that we can influence and address that threat response through status, certainty, autonomy, what she calls her SCARF model. What our audience feels and thinks, but especially what they're feeling, is so important as we craft our message and think about delivering that message. Because the emotional dimension of communication, I believe, is as important to understand as the intellectual dimension of communication. So here's kind of the big picture as I summarize a few things. Think about the objectives. Why are we communicating? Communication is at that nexus between the sender and the receiver. It's very dynamic, and we have to think about both our communication from a sender perspective, if we're sending communication, as well as what our receivers are thinking and feeling. The stakeholder analysis model helps us systematically look at our stakeholders. In the end, the key is, are we being persuasive?